Life has a way of flipping everything when you least expect it. One moment, I'm a happy husband awaiting our first child. The next, I'm lost in a whirlwind of betrayal and chaos. What seemed like a dream shattered, leaving me doubting my wife, my marriage, and myself. My wife and I had been together for 6 years, married for 5. I'm 28, and she's 27. Right now, she's pregnant and off work, taking a break from her job as a police officer to prepare for the baby. But things started spiraling when 2 cops, who acted more like bullies than law enforcement, came knocking at my door to throw their weight around. It all led to a massive blowout fight that she instigated, ending with me kicking her out of the house. One of those cops, her former patrol partner, swaggered in like he owned the place, trying to intimidate me. This guy, who had worked alongside her for a year, acted as if his badge gave him some kind of moral high ground. But ever since she started working with him, something about her changed, and our marriage began to unravel. The argument that night got ugly. She crossed the line first, slapping me hard enough to leave a sting on my face. That was it for me. I told her to get out. Moments later, she called her cop buddy, and he wasted no time showing up at my doorstep, threatening me with arrest if I didn't back down. By then, I wasn't shocked. I'd been suspecting for a while that there was more to their partnership than what she let on. This just confirmed everything I feared. To understand how we got here, you need to know some background. This mess started back when she decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. After finishing her criminal justice degree at community college, she landed a job with the police department. At the time, we were struggling to make ends meet. I was between jobs, trying to figure things out, and the steady paycheck seemed like a godsend. The plan was never for her to stay on the force long-term, especially given the risks. I even tried to talk her out of it after she had a close call on the job. I'll never forget that day. She'd responded to a domestic violence call. A drunk guy was attacking his girlfriend. Her partner had called in sick, so she went alone, thinking it would be a routine situation. When she got there, she heard screaming and forced her way inside. By the time backup arrived, she was fighting for her life. The drunk guy had gone berserk, and she barely managed to hold him off. That night, I saw her in the hospital, battered and bruised. Her face was so swollen I could barely recognize her, and the doctor said she'd almost lost an eye. It was a wake-up call for both of us. She spent weeks recovering, both physically and emotionally. I stayed by her side every step of the way, sleeping on a cot in her hospital room for 2 days straight. After that, we had a serious talk about her leaving the force. I begged her to consider a safer career, like working for the TSA. It wouldn't pay as much, but at least I wouldn't have to worry every time she walked out the door. At the time, I was finishing up my training as a mechanic and picking up side jobs to keep us afloat. She agreed to ease back into work with a desk job, and for a while, things seemed better. But not long after she started back, she began complaining about how dull it was. She said she missed the action, but I reminded her of what almost happened when she went in alone without backup. I hoped she'd come around and accept a quieter, safer routine. It wasn't long before she started unloading every detail about her day as soon as she walked through the door. I'd listened because we couldn't afford therapy, and she clearly needed someone to vent to. About 6 months in, she started talking about a new guy at work, an ex-Marine who joined the department. She couldn't stop complaining about him. She called him arrogant, a hotshot, and even accused him of crossing lines with detainees. She hated his guts, or so she said. I told her she should report him if he was that bad, but she waved me off, saying it wasn't worth the trouble. To me, it sounded like she was jealous or annoyed. She's always had a strong dislike for arrogant types, and this guy seemed to tick all her boxes for people she couldn't stand. She even compared him to Trump once, said he reminded her of everything she hated about men like that. For weeks, her rants about him became a nightly routine. Then, out of the blue, she stopped talking about him altogether. At first, I felt relieved, thinking she'd finally let it go. But not long after, she started dropping hints about wanting to go back to patrol work. That's when the real cracks in our marriage began to show. I tried reasoning with her, reminding her how even light-duty work had almost landed her in the hospital last time. She brushed it off at first, but the topic kept coming up. She'd insist that patrol work would only involve easy, low-risk tasks. Then she started talking about working extra shifts. It didn't sit right with me. We weren't struggling financially, things were stable. She'd always said she wanted kids, and so did I, but I wasn't in any kind of rush. Her sudden interest in picking up more work seemed unnecessary. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was already back on patrol and keeping it from me. One night, after she mentioned working overtime, I decided to check things out myself. I drove down to the police station, hoping to catch her in the act. Unfortunately, I couldn't get into the office area without her noticing me. So I waited outside, thinking I might see her during a break or at the end of her shift. After a while, frustration got the better of me, and I headed home. When she returned, I confronted her. Without hesitation, she lied, claiming she'd spent the entire evening in her office. I couldn't prove otherwise since I hadn't seen her, and the department wouldn't let me inside. Determined to uncover the truth, I took a drastic step and bought a police scanner, just like something out of a movie. I spent the next 2 days listening in on her transmissions and recording them. It wasn't long before I found out her new patrol partner was none other than the arrogant ex-Marine she used to complain about. The same guy she once called Donald Trump because of his cocky attitude. At that point, I wasn't even thinking about infidelity. I was more worried about her dishonesty and the danger she was putting herself in. She seemed like she was chasing some fantasy of being a tough-as-nails action hero, something straight out of a cop drama. It baffled me that the department would even let her go back on patrol. When I confronted her that night, I laid out everything I knew. I pointed out how the guy she'd described as her worst enemy had somehow become her partner. She claimed it wasn't her decision and that he was the only one available. She even spun it as a positive, saying I should be glad she had someone capable watching her back. I fired back that if she'd stayed at her desk, or better yet, left the force altogether, she wouldn't need anyone to protect her. She dismissed my concerns like I was overreacting. After catching her in this lie, she started talking about how much she loved being back on patrol, how it made her feel alive again. She even mentioned wanting to become a detective someday. Felt like I wasn't even talking to the same person. It was as if her partner was filling her head with these grandiose ideas. Looking back, that should have been a massive red flag, but I wanted to believe her and pushed my doubts aside. Over the next few months, she became a completely different person. The way she talked, the things she cared about, it all changed. She started acting like a stranger. Her hours were all over the place, and any time we spent together depended on when her partner decided to work overtime. She'd cancel plans with me just to go out on patrol with him. When I suggested she ask the department for a new partner, her response sent me over the edge. She said she didn't want to let him down. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about work. I started to suspect she was having an affair. I confronted her directly, asking if she could stop working with him because of how it made me feel. Her reaction was defensive. She called me insecure and brushed off my concerns, insisting he was happily married with kids and would never cheat on his wife. But the way she went out of her way to defend his loyalty only made things worse. To me, it sounded like she'd at least thought about it. She even mentioned how other women at work were always after him, as if that was supposed to make me feel better. And then there was the fact that he liked every single one of her Facebook photos. Who does that? Especially a married guy? When I brought it up, she just shrugged and said, "He's my partner." Her indifference to how much it hurt me left me fuming. I pressed her to stop working with him, but she lied again, claiming they weren't even partners anymore. I wasn't buying it, so I checked around and found out from people at her job that they were still riding together. Eventually, she announced she wanted to take a break from the force to focus on starting a family. She told me she was planning to stop her birth control, and I didn't think much of it. Maybe she saw how her partner had a family and wanted the same for herself. I wanted kids too, so I didn't question her timing. About a month later, she was pregnant. Around that same time, I got a great job offer as a field technician for a medical equipment company. The pay was fantastic, but it required me to travel 3 days a week. By the time I started, she was about 3 or 4 months along and had already stepped away from work. With her at home all day, I didn't think much of her routine until a neighbor gave me a heads up. This neighbor, a decent guy I'd helped with some car repairs before, told me he'd noticed a police officer visiting our house every day while I was gone. He said the guy would park in front and stay for hours. My wife wasn't supposed to be working, so why was a cop hanging around? When she got home, I asked her straight up about it. At first, she denied everything. But when I told her the neighbor had seen the guy, her story changed. She said she'd been lonely while I was away and that the visits were completely innocent. I asked why she hadn't called one of her friends instead of him. That's when she got defensive, accusing me of being paranoid and insecure. I snapped back, telling her the real problem was her shady behavior. Things escalated quickly. She slapped me twice and tried for a third, but I caught her wrist before she could. She was 5 months pregnant, so I was careful not to hurt her, but I wasn't surprised by her outburst. She'd hit me before, usually when she knew she was in the wrong. I'd had enough. I grabbed her, spun her around, lifted her up, and carried her to the door while she thrashed, cursing and screaming. I knew the neighbors could hear, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her stay in the house that night. I gently set her down outside and locked the door before she could push her way back in. She pounded on the door for a while but eventually gave up and went to the neighbor's house to borrow a phone. Instead of reaching out to her family, friends, or even the police like any rational person might, she called her arrogant patrol partner, the same guy I'd suspected all along. He showed up at my house, acting as if he owned the place, and brought another officer with him for backup. They came at me with all kinds of accusations, but I wasn't about to let them get away with it. I had clear evidence. Marks from where she hit me and pictures to prove she was the aggressor. Of course, her partner didn't seem to care about any of that. It was obvious he wanted to flex his authority and pave the way for his affair with my wife. She'd already lied, claiming I was the one who started the fight, but she had no proof to back her up. Still, even with the evidence on my side, I ended up in handcuffs, treated like a criminal in my own home, and ordered to leave for the night. I spent that night at my neighbor's place, replaying everything in my mind. The betrayal, the lies, it all hit me like a freight train. I knew I couldn't let this slide. I'm already planning to sue that cop, especially since he falsified the incident report. The next morning, I returned home, hoping to address things. My wife seemed apologetic, spouting apologies for hitting me and for lying. But at that point, her words felt like nothing more than empty noise. The damage was already done. Even though her lies had nearly ruined me, I told her we needed to separate, at least until after the baby was born. She looked panicked, worried about how she'd support herself without my help until she could return to work. I told her to lean on that friend she'd been so quick to call for backup. The very next day, I packed my things and moved out. I agreed to keep paying half the rent since my name was on the lease, but there was no way I could keep living in that house, knowing she was likely involved with another man. She denied it, of course, but I wasn't buying it. To me, the truth was glaringly obvious. Barely 2 days after I left, the calls started. She couldn't stop ringing me, begging me to come back. I told her I was out of town for work and that it was best for us to stay apart for now. My plan was to go back later to pick up the rest of my things after finishing my current field assignment. We stayed in touch, mostly through phone calls, but every time I brought up the possibility of her having an affair, she'd deny it and fly off the handle, accusing me of being paranoid. She even started twisting the narrative, painting herself as the victim to anyone who would listen. Somehow, she managed to turn our family and friends against me, accusing me of abandoning her and spreading false accusations. Even my parents, who'd always been supportive of me, started siding with her because they were eager to become grandparents. When I told them about her shady behavior and the fact that she'd called her partner to throw me out, they refused to believe it. Her father, who never liked me to begin with, even called to threaten me. I didn't even bother arguing with him. I just hung up. She'd also gone to our 3 mutual friends first, crying about how I had left her. They believed every word of her sob story, dismissing my concerns and assuming she'd never do anything as awful as cheating. Meanwhile, I had already contacted my lawyer about suing the police department for what I saw as an illegal detainment and eviction. That officer even had the audacity to file a false report against me. Over the next couple of weeks, we kept having long, drawn-out phone conversations, trying to make sense of everything. But she twisted the story at every turn, somehow convincing almost everyone to take her side. Without concrete proof of an affair, I started doubting myself. My neighbor, who had been keeping an eye on the house for me, told me he hadn't seen any police car parked outside recently and that my wife hardly left the house except for groceries. For a while, I wondered if I had been wrong. About a month after we separated, with her now 6 months pregnant, we decided to reconcile. I moved back in, hoping we could make things work. At first, it felt like old times, almost as if the nightmare we'd been through had never happened. She acted normal, like she had nothing to hide. But with my new job requiring me to travel more often, I couldn't shake my lingering doubts. To make sure I wasn't being blind to something, I installed hidden cameras around the house in the bedroom, living room, and driveway. I needed to know what was happening while I was away. For the next month, I reviewed the footage religiously after every trip. But to my surprise, nothing suspicious showed up. Her partner never came around, and her behavior seemed completely innocent. Eventually, I started to let go of my suspicions, even though a small part of me still felt uneasy. By the time she was 7.5 months pregnant, it finally felt like we were putting the past behind us. With her due date just around the corner, I made the decision to cut back on my work travel so I could be closer to her. I figured it was important to be around as we prepared to welcome our son, but spending more time together only revealed more cracks in our relationship. I couldn't help but notice how attached she was to her phone. It seemed like it never left her hand, constantly lighting up with messages. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just friends or family checking in on her. But as the days went on, it started to gnaw at me. What really got to me wasn't just how often she was texting. It was how she acted while doing it. She'd smile to herself or quietly laugh at something on the screen. But if I glanced over, she'd tilt the phone away, almost as if she didn't want me to see. I told myself I was overthinking things. After all, she was heavily pregnant, and I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. But one night, while we were watching TV together, she got a text, and instead of replying in front of me, she immediately got up and walked to the bathroom. That was the moment my suspicions hit a breaking point. I muted the TV and quietly got up, standing just outside the bathroom door. All I could hear was the rapid tapping of her fingers on the screen. It didn't sound like an emergency or anything important, just a casual conversation she clearly didn't want me to know about. My wife's phone had fingerprint verification, and we'd never shared passwords, so there wasn't much I could do in the moment. But later that night, once she was sound asleep, I carefully took her hand and used her finger to unlock the phone. My heart was racing as I slipped into the bathroom to check her messages. The most recent conversation was with someone named Wendy. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The last message from Wendy simply said, "Sweet dreams." But something about it didn't sit right with me. Earlier that evening, my wife had spent a solid 30 minutes texting in the bathroom. Yet the last message before Wendy's was from 3 hours prior. She'd obviously gone through and deleted parts of the conversation, which only confirmed my fears. My stomach churned as I copied down Wendy's number before carefully locking her phone and sneaking back into bed. I barely slept that night, torn between anger and heartbreak. The next day, during my lunch break, I found a payphone and dialed the number. I had a hunch about who it might belong to, but I needed to be sure. Posing as a utility worker, I casually mentioned a name, and the man on the other end of the line responded, "This is me." It was her patrol partner. My worst suspicions came crashing back. Every lie, every evasive answer, every suspicious glance now made perfect sense. Still, I felt too drained mentally and emotionally to confront her just yet. With her due date so close, I decided to hold off until after the baby was born before making any big decisions. Every time I looked at her, especially with her pregnant belly, I felt like I was being torn in two. Part of me still clung to the hope that we could have a real family, that somehow this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the other part of me couldn't forget the lies, the secrecy, and the overwhelming feeling that I was being made a fool of. The stress was unbearable. I was anxious, depressed, and constantly on edge, wondering what other truths she might be hiding. I'd sit there, imagining the life I wanted for my son, and question if I was about to repeat every mistake I'd promised myself I'd never make. Finally, a few months later, the baby arrived. She gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. Not once did it cross my mind that the baby might not be mine. He looked more like her, sure, but newborns don't give much away. I was just happy to be a dad. A few days after we brought him home from the hospital, though, I couldn't hold back anymore. I confronted her about the texts. I told her I knew about the number she had been messaging and that I'd called it. Her patrol partner had answered. At first, she tried to play it off, saying it was just a female friend. But I wasn't buying her story. When she kept denying everything, I suggested we settle it right then. Open up her messages and call the number on speakerphone. The way she flat out refused to do it was the final nail in the coffin for me. I told her I was done and that I'd be moving out again. That's when she broke down, crying and admitting the truth. She confessed the number belonged to her coworker, her patrol partner. She claimed she'd hidden his contact because he was texting her constantly and she didn't want to seem rude by ignoring him. She said she used a fake name for him because she knew I'd be upset if I found out. I wasn't impressed. I told her that if she wanted to save our marriage, she needed to quit her job and block him immediately. To her credit, she agreed on the spot. She blocked him in front of me and even showed me the screen for proof. But I wasn't naive. I knew she could unblock him anytime and keep their conversations going behind my back. Still, part of me wanted to believe she was genuinely trying to fix things. After that, life seemed to calm down. Our families came over to meet the baby and celebrate his arrival. For a little while, it almost felt like we were turning a corner. We even started looking at houses, hoping to finally leave renting behind. To save for a down payment, I picked up more travel assignments at work, which meant being away from home more often. With my wife unemployed and staying home with the baby, money was tight, but I wanted her to have the chance to raise him herself rather than relying on daycare. It felt like the right thing to do, even though it put extra strain on me. But then, a few months later, the red flags started popping up again. While I was away on field assignments, there were times she wouldn't answer my calls or return them, even during the evening when she should have been home. It didn't add up. She wasn't working, and her main responsibility was caring for our son. Suspicious, I reached out to my neighbor, the same one who'd tipped me off before. He told me he'd noticed my wife spending nights away from home when I was out of town. That revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew she'd never come clean unless I caught her in the act. The next week, after returning from a trip, I decided to take action. I bought a GPS tracker and discreetly installed it in her car. I wanted to know exactly where she was going with our baby when I wasn't around and why she was dodging my calls. To keep her from suspecting anything, I told her I'd be traveling out of state for work again, but instead, I stayed local to monitor her movements. That same evening, I followed her as she drove to a gated apartment complex I'd never seen before. I parked nearby and waited until another car opened the gate so I could slip inside. Once in, I found a spot a few spaces away and watched as she carried the baby into one of the apartments. I couldn't see which unit she went into, so I decided to test her honesty. I called her. She didn't pick up at first, but about half an hour later, she called me back, acting like nothing was wrong. I asked where she was, and she told me she'd been busy with the baby. When I casually asked if she was at home, she didn't miss a beat, insisting she was. I told her my work assignment had wrapped up early and that I'd be home in an hour. Her response was shaky. She stammered something about needing to tidy up before I arrived. It was painfully obvious she was lying. She quickly ended the call, promising to check in once I landed. Not 10 minutes later, I saw her walking out of the apartment. She had the baby swing in one hand and the diaper bag in the other. My heart sank. She looked around nervously before heading back to her car, completely unaware I was sitting just a few spaces away, watching everything unfold. The moment I saw her patrol partner standing there, holding my child like he was the father, my worst fears became reality. She hadn't cut ties with him like she promised, and the sight of them together was a gut punch. Right then, I couldn't help but question whether the baby I'd been pouring my heart into was even mine. Anger and heartbreak boiled over, and I walked straight up to them. Both of them froze, stunned as I confronted them. I didn't mince words. I told her there was no point in coming back home. I'd seen enough. She didn't even try to apologize. Instead, they left in a hurry, not looking back. I called her father immediately, laying everything out for him. I told him his daughter had been unfaithful, that I had serious doubts about the baby's paternity, and that I wasn't holding back anymore. After years of deception and manipulation, I let my frustration pour out. When I returned to the house as expected, she was already gone. The next day, she called me in tears, insisting she hadn't done anything wrong. She said she needed to stop by to pick up some things for the baby, food, clothes, and other essentials. I agreed but told her I wouldn't be there when she came. I made it clear I was moving forward with a divorce and questioning whether the baby was even mine. She adamantly insisted that he was, warning me I'd regret doubting her. I told her there was only one way to know for sure, a DNA test, and reminded her that her ongoing relationship with her partner made it impossible for me to trust her. When she showed up later, she brought a female friend with her, probably hoping to avoid any further confrontation. I stayed away, refusing to talk to her. I was too hurt to even look at her. That same day, I ordered a DNA test kit and had it shipped overnight. The waiting was unbearable. I avoided her as much as possible because the thought of what I might discover weighed on me heavily. How could I have given so much of myself to this child, only to face the possibility he wasn't even mine? The kit arrived quickly, but it wasn't easy to get a swab from the baby. She rarely left his side, and her friend stuck around, likely trying to keep the situation calm. After 3 days, her friend finally left, realizing I wasn't going to cause a scene. I asked to hold the baby one last time. It was an incredibly painful moment. I cared deeply for him and desperately wanted him to be mine. Despite everything, I still clung to a shred of hope that the test would prove my doubts wrong. Eventually, I managed to get the sample and send it off without her knowing. The waiting felt endless. A few days later, while I was across town for work, the results came in. I logged in, my heart pounding. The words on the screen hit me like a sledgehammer. The baby wasn't mine. I shared the results with my parents, wanting them to understand the truth and see that I wasn't making baseless accusations. Deep down, I still wished the results were different, even though they confirmed what I already feared. I sent the results to her father too, hoping he'd finally recognize the damage his daughter had done. I didn't confront her directly with the results. By then, I was sure she already suspected what I had discovered. Legally, because we were married when the baby was born, I was presumed to be the father. That meant I had to go through the courts to officially sever the legal relationship, free myself from any child support obligations, and finalize the divorce. I contacted a divorce attorney immediately to get the process rolling. Now, 14 months after divorcing my unfaithful wife, my life looks completely different. I left the city I grew up in, partly because of the harassment I kept facing from the police. I filed complaints and even took legal action twice, winning one case, but the harassment never stopped. Eventually, I decided it wasn't worth it anymore and left. My job keeps me traveling, but I wanted a place to unwind, so I bought several acres of land in the countryside. It's become my retreat, where I can hunt, camp, and get away from it all. When my ex was served the divorce papers while I was out of town, the situation turned into an absolute circus. She kept calling, but I ignored every attempt she made to reach me. 2 days later, I rented a U-Haul and went back to pack up my things. She was there when I arrived and tried to stop me from leaving, pleading for me to stay, but I wasn't interested in hearing any more of her excuses. I only took what was mine, leaving behind anything we'd shared together. I wanted a clean break, a chance to truly start over. With the DNA results now out in the open, her lies had been exposed for everyone to see. The friends she'd manipulated into siding with her couldn't deny the truth anymore. Before I walked out the door for the last time, I asked if I could hold the baby one final time. She hesitated but eventually handed him to me. As I held him, I felt an ache in my chest. Despite everything, I wished he was mine. I wanted to be his father, to raise him and give him the life I had envisioned. But the reality was unavoidable. My ex started crying, apologizing for all the pain she'd caused, but I couldn't listen. I quickly handed the baby back, feeling my own emotions rising to the surface. I didn't want her to see me break down. Without another word, I walked out and didn't look back. For a while, I stayed with my parents to save money while I figured out my next steps. Eventually, I found a secluded property in the countryside, far from the chaos I'd left behind. The land came with a small lake, perfect for hunting, camping, and finding peace in the quiet solitude I craved. It became my haven, a place where I could breathe again. When I'm not traveling for work, I spend my days there, finally feeling like I've reclaimed some control over my life. Even though I've moved on, I can't help but feel like I wasn't the only one who suffered. My ex-wife is living with the consequences of her actions, and the baby, completely innocent in all of this, has been caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, her affair partner seems to have come out of it untouched. I don't know for certain if he's the father, but everything points to him. They'd been working together for over a year, and I caught him at my house, clearly there for her. He even rented a separate apartment for their meetups. Couldn't let him get away with it. I gathered all the evidence I had, the DNA test results, photos and texts, and made a plan to confront the situation. But not with him. I wanted his wife to know the truth. Using a paid search service, I found his home address and confirmed who his wife was. Once I had her information, I waited until I knew he'd be at work. When the timing was right, I delivered a package of evidence to his wife, detailing everything. A few days later, life threw me another curveball. One night, as I was leaving a friend's house, I was pulled over by a police officer. I wasn't speeding, hadn't run any lights, and wasn't breaking any laws. Curious and cautious, I wondered why I had been stopped. At first, when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror, I thought it might be my ex-wife's affair partner. But when the officer approached my car, I realized it was someone I didn't recognize. The whole thing felt suspicious, though, especially since I hadn't had any run-ins with the police in years. He claimed I was speeding, but I knew for a fact I wasn't. Still, I decided to take the ticket to avoid the hassle of fighting it in court. Then, just a week later, I got pulled over again, this time for supposedly speeding once more. I was certain I'd been driving well within the limit. This second stop didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt personal. The officer asked for my license and registration, then started asking strange, accusatory questions, like whether I had any warrants or if the car I was driving was stolen. It was absurd, and I told them so, which only seemed to aggravate them further. When they ordered me out of the car, I refused, asking to speak to a supervisor and explaining that I hadn't done anything wrong. That didn't go over well. They called for backup, forcibly pulled me from the car, and handcuffed me on the spot. The whole ordeal left me with cuts on my wrists, a split lip, and lingering back pain. I spent the night in jail before my parents bailed me out. When they saw my injuries, they were furious and urged me to file a formal complaint against the officers. It became painfully clear that my ex-wife's affair partner was likely behind this harassment. My parents were deeply worried for my safety and convinced me that moving away was the best option. They were right. It was clear staying in the area wasn't worth the risk. If the officers involved had planted something in my car or escalated things further, my life could have been completely derailed. I decided to fight back legally. I filed a lawsuit against my ex-wife's partner for filing a false police report and another suit against the arresting officers for unlawful arrest and false imprisonment. I knew winning these cases would require strong evidence, so I built my case around the affair, the fabricated report, and the DNA test results. In the end, I won a settlement against her partner, but the case for false imprisonment was dismissed. I'm planning to appeal that decision. To add to the fallout, I also filed an official complaint against her partner with the police department, using the civil judgment as leverage. This led to disciplinary action against him, and though it wasn't enough to get him fired, the incident will stay on his record permanently. Not long after, I heard through the grapevine that his wife finally left him. I imagine she uncovered the extent of his lies and decided she couldn't stay in the marriage. Maybe that's why he's been so vindictive. It's easier for him to blame me than take responsibility for the destruction he caused. As for my ex-wife, I haven't spoken to her directly. From what mutual friends have told me, she's back to working as a police officer and is now living with her affair partner in the very apartment where I caught them together. Meanwhile, I've started trying to rebuild my life. I've ventured back into dating, mostly through online platforms, setting up dates around my travel schedule. I've met some great women, and a few seem like they could be serious partners. But if I'm being honest, I'm hesitant to jump into marriage again. After years of being deceived, it's hard to shake the feeling that I've lost a big part of myself. Sometimes, I still catch myself wondering what drives people to betray the ones they claim to love. Is it just human nature? Or are we all just fooling ourselves, thinking we can ever truly know another person?